Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be discussing South Korean popular music, very specifically K-pop. It's going to be a whole bunch of really high quality, fast moving, fast paced sound samples towards the end that have lots of visual information as well. But in order to understand where K-pop comes from and why it is so widely popular today, we're going to have to take a look at Korean American immigrants, what has happened in the history of Korean American immigration, or rather immigration to America, and what has happened in the cultural wake of these movements here. So as always, I have prepared some lecture notes, which I have right here, but I will pull them up on the screen. Here's where we're kind of headed for today. We're going to, as always, divide things out into 4 segments. We're going to deal with the upper left-hand quadrant for part 1. So to start us off, Korean Americans are, of course, Americans of Korean ancestry. And at the current juncture, this group makes up 0.6% of the population, or roughly 1.8 million people. The largest regions that or the regions that have significant densities of Korean American immigrants include this list. So Los Angeles, so we're going to be focusing on the West Coast, New York, and New York comes up a lot, as you can obviously tell. San Francisco, again, West Coast, Seattle, and Philadelphia. But what we can see from this list is that major metropolitan areas are on the list. So we have some important events that happen in the 20th century that that lead to 2 significant waves of Korean Americans immigrating to the U.S. However, we're going to sort of set the stage for these waves in 1924. And the US Congress in 1924 designated Asia as a barred zone from which immigration was totally prohibited. Asians were ineligible for citizenship and thus could not own property. Korean Americans were also subjected to employment discrimination and to housing segregation, which made things all the more difficult. And this very strict prohibition ended up being lifted during the Korean War in 1952. But to kind of understand the depth of, I guess, the social temperature that was happening at the turn of the century, I want to speak a little bit about the trend of nativism and how that starts to impact, immigration policy. Very specifically, of course, our center of focus is the US. So let me go ahead and pull up our first video for today.
In the 1920s, a new wave of nativism swept across the United States. What is nativism? What were the results of this movement? The United States has long had a history of being distrustful of immigrants. Even in the earliest days of the nation, laws such as the Alien and Sedition Act were passed, which limited the rights of immigrants. In the 1850s, many started using the term nativist to describe those who opposed Irish Catholic immigrants. The term was used to describe those who descended from the original 13 colonies, rather than referring to Native Americans as the term native would be used today. During the years of World War I, there was a strong sentiment against German Americans. Many Germans still lived in isolated communities, separate from other Americans. They also maintained their own schools, which conducted educational instruction in German rather than American English. The German language was also still spoken in most German American households. To express their distrust of Germans, many American towns and cities changed street names and even city names to avoid connections to the German language. Other towns forbade churches and schools from conducting business in any other language except English. Following World War I, nativists turned their focus towards Southern and Eastern European immigrants, specifically those coming from Poland, the Balkans, and the region near the Mediterranean Sea. Many of the immigrants coming from these regions were Catholic or Jewish, which nativists were also opposed to. Nativists had several different arguments for opposing immigration. Some feared that an influx of unskilled laborers would take jobs away from Americans. Others believed that the nation's genetic and racial purity was being damaged by what they believed were inferior races from these Eastern European nations. Nativist philosophies did have an impact on national policy. In 1921, the United States Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act. This law placed a strict limitation on the number of immigrants that entered the country. This limitation stated that only 357,803 immigrants could come from outside the Western Hemisphere. 3 years later, another law was passed. The Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the National Origins Act, significantly decreased the number of immigrants who could enter the country to 164,687. The Immigration Act did not completely stop the flow of immigrants coming into the United States, but instead reduced the number considerably. Immigrants arriving from Canada and Mexico were exempt from the provisions of the Immigration Act. Therefore, the actual number of immigrants arriving in the late 1920s was approximately 270,000 a year.
So, one of the reasons that we don't see, as you can tell from the video, there were lots of clips of propaganda that were promoting the nativist agenda, right? A lot of them spoke specifically to immigration acts. And one of the reasons why we don't see Koreans really depicted is because, or really anyone from the Asian communities, is because they had completely barred immigration from those areas. This obviously changes in 1952. And that's when we experience our first major wave of Koreans coming over to America. Before we get there, I want to talk just from another perspective about how, and look at some numbers, some very interesting infographics on the history of immigration acts and how it has changed the influx of numbers of immigrants over time. So let me go ahead and pull that up.
So the issue of who to let into this country and who not to let into this country is about as old as the country itself. It's an issue that America has debated since the early 19th century, and we've admitted people from nearly every single country since, but it hasn't really been an even admission process. So this line represents 200,000 legal immigrants to the U.S., and we're going to stack them up to see when they came to the U.S. and where they came from. So early on, most were European, largely Irish, German, and British, and there were also Chinese and Canadian immigrants. But in 1882, the U.S. passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. That was extended and then made permanent, and it wasn't repealed for 61 years. The economic depression of the 1890s decreased European immigration and nearly stopped Canadian immigration entirely. But after the Depression, the demographics of immigrants changed, and there was a rise in Russian, Italian, Spanish, and Japanese immigrants. In 1917, the U.S. banned immigration from Asian countries entirely except for the Philippines and Japan. In 1921, the U.S. capped immigration based on nationality. This severely limited the ability to immigrate to the U.S. for people not from the Western Hemisphere or a country with older roots in the U.S. Then the Great Depression happened. All immigration plummeted. Then World War II happened. The U.S. refused to increase immigration caps for 20,000 Jewish children fleeing Nazi rule. It also stopped naturalization proceedings for Italians, Germans, and Japanese. In 1952, the U.S. stopped excluding immigrants based on race, but more stringent quotas meant most slots were still for Western Europeans. In 1965, the quota system was entirely repealed. It allowed for a far more diverse group of immigrants, particularly from Central America and South America, but also Asia. In the 1970s and 80s, Asian immigrants arrived in huge numbers, largely from the Philippines, South Korea, India, and Hong Kong. The U.S. also evacuated 130,000 people from Vietnam after the war. In the 1990s, the U.S. increased immigration caps to 700,000 annually. The country began to invest in border security to discourage unauthorized migration, but in exchange allowed nearly 1.7 million Mexican immigrants in the 1990s. Immigration to the U.S. is now more diverse than ever. But with the rise of ISIS and the Syrian refugee crisis, prominent politicians are again talking about which immigrant groups to restrict.
And I think that's an important part that our speaker ends on, is that our very problematic history has had an interestingly strange revolving door of who is let in and who is excluded. Again, some of those early examples that we see, or that we have seen for propaganda purposes, really pinpoint the groups that are being targeted in a specific decade. So hopefully those numbers and everything sort of lined up with one another gives you a very quick but bigger scope of what is, in part going to change the cultural makings of the United States as a whole. Of course, and our focus is through music traditions. So all of these changes in numbers and groups are going to very much impact the fabric of our culture and society, and again, very specifically music. And even without today, maybe the movement of particular groups, still the impact of technology has a similar result when it comes to the diversification of the music that we are listening to, and the new hybrid genres that are coming forth. I want to take a look at one more slice of history in this particular section, which focuses on 1965. But before then, why don't I toggle back to my lecture notes and talk about the first two waves of immigration. Okay, so as discussed, the prohibition, like I said, for immigrants from Asian communities was lifted in 1952, and that was during the Korean War. Sorry, I'm reading from my lecture notes, which is easier from the screen. This finally also allowed Korean Americans to vote, which was huge. Voting gives you a voice in our particular society. Whether or not you agree to voting or not, that's up to you. So, like I said, Korean immigration happened in two waves. They're marked here in 1950 and then in 1967. The 1950 immigration wave was greatly impacted by the Korean War. Why? So women, this group that came in the 1950s were generally women who were married to soldiers who were American. Or children that were adopted into white families. So to just give you some numbers from 1950, 100,000 military brides between 1950 and 89 total were documented, and 300,000 Korean children adopted as well. So we're going to talk about both that and what happens in 1965. So the second wave happens in 1967, and it's mostly that Koreans came to the US under the occupational and family reunification preferences that were set up in the 65 Immigration Act. And most of these individuals settled into major metropolitan areas where, you know, these regions up here that I mentioned at the beginning of lecture. So two more videos that I want to play for us. One is about the Immigration Act of 1965. It has a particularly profound impact on the community that we're discussing for today's lecture. And then also, I'd love to draw some attention to the history of adopting children from Korea as well, and why that ends up being established in such large numbers in the 1950s. As you can see, like, it's 3 times the amount of military brides that came over. So I think it's interesting to look at why that occurs, because bringing in children certainly is going to have an impact on culture and redefining some aspects of culture just through the viewpoint of different cultures and ethnicities and people. So let's first, what do I do first? I want to talk about the Immigration Act of 1965 first. So let me go ahead and pull up our video.
America has always been a land of immigrants. A century ago, most came from Europe. But in recent decades, changes in immigration law have opened the nation's doors to a new wave of immigrants who once again changed the face of America.
The 1965 Immigration Act completely transformed the Asian American community, and I would argue completely transforms America. It really changes the last important Immigration Act, which is the 1924 Immigration Act. The 1965 Immigration Act allocates an equal number for every country in the world, 20,000. It allows Asian immigrants to come in on the same basis as any other country in the world. So now they constitute about 4% of the American population, 10 to 12 million.
The 1965 Act said that family reunification was one of the top preferences. So if you had relatives in China, you could sponsor them under the 1965 Act. Now, my mother immigrated in 1941, before this happened. But one of the promises that she made when she left China to come to this country was that she would find a way to bring her 2 brothers from China to the United States when she got here. So after the 1965 Act passed, my mother immediately began going to classes and trying to learn English and get ready for passing the citizenship test so that she can become a U.S. citizen. So in 1972, she's able to send her brother from Hong Kong, sponsor him to come to the United States. And he brought his wife, and his wife had children here. And then later, when he became a citizen, he was able to send for the other brother from China after 1979, when that became possible.
The Immigration Act of 1965 also propelled a dramatic rise in Latino immigration, increasing ethnic diversity in the society as a whole and within the immigrant communities themselves.
You cannot assume now that if you see an individual that is of Latin American background, that that individual is Mexican, or you cannot assume that that individual is Puerto Rican. So we need a new term, and many people are turning to the term Latino. When you have people, for example, from Guatemala and El Salvador settling down in communities that are predominantly Mexican, you start talking about a blending of cultures and a differentiation of Latino culture.
So we're going to focus on Latino music in another section, but really fascinating what the Immigration Act of 1965 does. It really uproots what's happening in the Immigration Act of 1924. And because, specifically, again, Korea had not had any entrance into the United States. Really, it was incredibly limited and completely barred from Asian countries overall. That finally opening that door is going to impact some major changes. In part two, there's another slice of history that we need to account for that has a major impact on Korean culture and Korean cultural imports, and that is the Korean War. We're not going to get to it in this first part. I want to talk and close our first part talking about the adoption of Korean children and the history of that and why that impacts our cultural fabric.
South Korea's adoption program began after the Korean War, and it was directly related to children coming from the relationships between Korean women and GI soldiers.
The Korean War was a devastating conflict and complicated interplay of foreign powers that we won't unpack in this video. But here's how it relates to Korean adoption. The US had 2 million soldiers serving in Korea during the war, and many of them used Korean women for sex. This led to thousands of mixed-race babies. What is the push factor from Korea that leads to adoptions abroad?
So at the time of the beginning of Korean adoption, it was, well, let's find them a home in the United States, Australia, abroad, because they won't be able to assimilate in Korean society, just because Koreans are so proud of their bloodline and their heritage.
It wasn't just mixed-race babies. Even fully Korean kids had trouble getting adopted because of the value put on bloodlines. And a strong stigma against single mothers led many to give up their kids. This led to a cycle of dependency on international adoption. At the same time, Christian groups encouraged Americans to save these babies by bringing them to the States.
On board is a happy little Korean orphan. He's got his passport, he's got a new home in America, and he's got new parents too.
International adoption from South Korea became so big and so easy that by the 80s, the country was raking in up to $20 million a year. And the adoption agencies weren't always following the rules.
In their minds, it was, how do we find families for these children? Sometimes paperwork needed to be changed. They were saying, instead of the birth parents being married, they were separate. Instead of the adoptee having siblings, they were saying, oh, the birth parents only had this one child.
In some cases, children were taken away from their parents by family members and given up for adoption without the parents' consent.
And that's a more complicated issue that we're not going to unpack in this part of my lecture. But I wanted to give you some sort of idea of what brought on the initial influx of Korean adoption and kind of what perpetuated it. We have a big fall, as you could see, in the 1980s, but the two biggest waves of immigration, like I said, the 1950s and 1967, right after this new Immigration Act passed in 65. So when we return for part two, I want to introduce us a little bit to K-pop, what we're going to be headed towards. But we are going to spend a little bit more time dissecting history and how it intersects with music. So I will see you for part two shortly.